Hello and welcome to our very first live stream Talking Politics Q&A. Robert and I are here, as you can see, to answer all of your questions about the welfare reform bill and indeed anything else you'd like to ask us. Please post your questions in the chat's live stream and we'll answer as many as we can over the next half hour or so. We'll also bring you the result of the vote live when it happens. Not that there is much tension in that right now because the government has just done a massive U-turn again. It's turning into their speciality, having effectively made one massive concession about this bill. They have, within the last hour, made another massive concession. Robert, you better start off by telling us what it is and whether there's really anything left in this bill worth passing.
So it is now a giveaway bill. It's a bill that...
It's the kind of bill we like.
You like a bill that Labour MPs and you might say so there's nothing nasty left in this bill. So on Thursday, remember I revealed that they were abandoning any detriment to anybody currently disabled receiving personal independence payment or the ill health part of universal credit. That already cost them £2.5 billion to protect all current claimants. There was then a lot of concern from charities and from some Labour MPs that it would create a two-tier system because the detriment would be suffered from anybody claiming after November 2026, and many people, myself included, in a sort of blog I wrote yesterday and on News at 10 last night, pointed out that there was now a big contradiction in the legislation because on the one hand they were saying that these new rules, which would deprive quite a lot of vulnerable people of this personal independence payment, would happen in November 2026, but they also simultaneously confirmed that there would be a review of the whole system, including the criteria for deciding whether somebody gets personal independence payment, would be led by a minister called Stephen Timms, who's been around forever, as you know, and he would do it not consulting disability groups and disability and those who are disabled, but as a co-production. They would have as much of a voice as he would. Yeah. And so, a number of Labour MPs, and actually the leading, I suppose, voice for this was a select committee chaired Labour called Debbie Abrahams, who's the chair of the Work and Pensions Committee. She pointed out, but as I say, it was sort of obviously to point out, I pointed this out yesterday, that you can't on the one hand say, don't worry disabled people, Stephen Timms is only going to do stuff that is fair and reasonable and humane, and you will influence him, and in fact you will help to author these reforms, and simultaneously say, by the way, we've already made up our minds, we're taking a bunch of money away from a load of people next year. So that last bit, that they're going to take a bunch of money away from people at the end of next year, they have literally minutes ago said they're dropping, which means that a reform that actually, it started off, not a lot of people know this, but before the spring statement, the Chancellor's spring statement, the Treasury were looking for £10 billion of savings from these welfare reforms. Keir Starmer intervened and they got it down to £5 billion.
And now they've got a big fat zero.
Then it came down to £2.5 billion last week, and now it's zilch, literally nothing, right?
Okay.
Which sort of means, because she was banking on this, because things aren't going so well in terms of the so-called fiscal rules. So she's going to have to find quite a lot of money.
OK, let's come to that, because I'm sure we'll get questions on it. Let's crack through some of these questions. Keep the questions coming. We'll try and keep out the pace. Jane, why have the government, let me get the word out, perpetuated the lie that removing support to disabled people will facilitate access to work? I guess I would say in simple answer to that, because nobody likes to set out a bill where all they are saying is, we're going to take money from disabled people. That's a pretty hard political sell. It was a hard enough political sell as it is. Would you like to add anything to that?
Look, there are a lot of people, actually this is something that a lot of Tories said before the election, that they thought the rules that the Tories put in place were being gamed by some people. They did claim that there were large numbers of people who shouldn't be receiving personal independence payment who were. Now, let's be clear, the government has not proved that. It hasn't explicitly made the case. And the reason for that is because, although if you just talk to, your average person out there, they'll say, they think with all welfare that there's sort of fraud going on. Actually, nobody's proved that there's not been a rigorous study of how much of personal independence payment is going to people who don't deserve it. And so actually, although that's the sort of subtext that the government wanted people to run with, wanted people in the country to run with, they couldn't ever say it publicly because they couldn't prove that there was fraud of this sort. And so was it Jane you said?
Jane you said.
So I think Jane's absolutely right. The reason this thing in the end has collapsed is because what the government ultimately said, which was a more respectable thing to say, is that they would help people into work with all these sort of work coaches and that kind of thing. The problem was that this system for providing support to help vulnerable people into work, wasn't going to be up and running, well, certainly not on full scale for years. And so people just thought, well, we don't really trust that people are going to get the support to get into jobs and maintain their living standards.
Okay, Mike, are you aware if there are any plans to do a triple lock the way this happens to pensions for those on benefits? This would support people like me struggling much better.
I can sort of see the case. Look, there are a lot of economists who will tell you that it is irrational and unaffordable that we have a triple lock for pensioners because retired people over the last 20 years have done way better, particularly than younger people in terms of what's happened to their living standards and the value of their assets. They own most of the housing stock for starters, right? And so there are quite a lot of economists who will tell you, you should abolish the triple lock. Politicians won't do it. This government went into the election, the Labour Party went into the election promising to maintain the triple lock because older people have a greater propensity to vote than younger people, and no party wants to lose their votes. I think there is an argument that in a fairer society, you would take greater steps to protect the incomes of the most vulnerable people. And there is no doubt that a lot of disabled people are on very low incomes and almost certainly would benefit from a bit more certainty about what would be happening to their living standards. I am afraid to say I don't expect that kind of commitment anytime soon from this government because this is a government that hasn't got very much money.
Okay, MG6065. I'm hoping there's a real person in there, or maybe this is the AI robots of the future. PIP payments. Surely reducing the availability and more scrutiny and vetting involved can only be a good thing. This will save millions and reduce the lack of job vacancies overnight. I think a lot of people who are struggling to get by and really need these payments would disagree with you, MG6065. And as Robert was saying, we're not sure there has been huge evidence of fraud. But Robert, what do you reckon?
Look, we've sort of actually addressed this in an earlier question, but there is another point that I think is worth making. It is that we have seen, it is true, a massive increase in people claiming personal independence payment. The rate at which people claim it in terms of numbers of people per day has something like doubled over the years since before COVID. And in fact, I think the increase is an order of magnitude even greater than that. Now, there are a number of possible explanations. Some people believe that this is the toxic legacy of COVID, that it did a lot of damage, particularly to young people's mental health, and there are a lot of people struggling with long COVID. And equally, the third factor is NHS became overwhelmed, and the ability of the NHS to help people, whether with physical problems or mental health problems, has been undermined. So if you had something that was wrong with you, 15 years ago, the NHS might try and fix you up at a relatively fast pace. Today, we all know what a problem that is. So there were those three things going on, which almost certainly have contributed to the rise in numbers of people claiming personal independence payments. But there is another important economic factor, which is that people's living standards since COVID, because of inflation, have been crushed, right? And if you are at the lower end of the income spectrum, you probably are struggling with either mental or physical ill health, but you also just have more of an incentive to claim whatever there is going, because the last few years have made you desperately poor. So I think, that doesn't mean that, it's some great scandal that these people are claiming this stuff. I think what we have to look at as a society is why there's so much ill health and why there are so many people basically on the breadline.
Okay, let's crack on. Edwina, there's been no mention of pensioners on PIP. Will it affect us?
There are pensioners on PIP. So all of this stuff was going to affect them. And actually, for now, everybody can breathe easy, because, no decisions are going to be made on, who gets it that's different from today until the Tim's review reports.
Marie asks, why not simply put 2p on income tax? Yes, people will kick off, but in the end it will be accepted. At least it will pay off some of the debt. I think, this is a pretty big question. And I suppose there are lots of aspects of it, but one of which is, what are they going to do about the now £5 billion problem they've got? They expected this to save £5 billion and it isn't going to save zilch, as we discussed earlier. So I'm interested to know where you think that leaves them. But there are, of course, then all the broader things, defence and everything else we've got to find money from. I would say 2p on income tax, certainly on the basic rate of income tax, is quite a lot. Not sure how popular it would be. What's your own sense of it?
This government promised in its manifesto it wouldn't put up income tax, and it rightly, it's done a lot that's wrong, but it rightly takes the view that manifesto commitments matter, that trust in politics and politicians is too low, and so whatever the economic rights and wrongs of putting up income tax, and plenty of economists will tell you it's way more rational to do that than what they did do, which was to push up the cost of employment by putting up employers' national insurance so significantly. And many people would have said that putting up income tax would have been a much more sensible thing to have done then. But they got themselves into a box, by promising not to in their manifesto. And the only way out of that box is not something. What was the question called again?
The question was about.
No. What was she called? The person.
Marie.
So the only circumstances, Maureen, in which this government or any government would break a pledge like that would be if we were at war, or there was some absolute crisis where the British people would at that point say all bets are off. But just because it would be convenient, this government is not going to do that. And we've all got to hope, frankly, so COVID, was one reason why the last government got away with essentially breaching its, it put up national insurance and, that felt like a pretty clear breach of what it had promised, right? COVID was a catastrophe. Right, let's hope we don't get another one of those.
Marie, you may remember that Nick Clegg went into the 2010 election promising not to raise tuition fees, then went into the coalition and promptly agreed to raise tuition fees. And I think most people would agree his reputation never recovered. So it's a very, very dangerous thing to do. Book of Kells, I'm furious that Labour are going after the most vulnerable and not the uber wealthy. Why are they not taxing the rich? I suppose the obvious answer would be that they have changed the rules on non-DOMs. There is some speculation they may reverse them. I guess the argument for not raising wealth taxes is more about the idea that wealthy people might leave the country. What do you think?
So this is a very unpopular point to make, and I'm certainly not arguing that those with most shouldn't pay more, but the statistics about how much of the tax burden is shouldered by those on highest incomes are pretty stark, right? I mean, I should have brought them in with me, but let's be clear, those at the top do pay a remarkable proportion of the overall amount of tax the government receives. Now, there is an argument for saying, for basically shifting taxation from income to an extent onto assets. It's why a lot of people talk about a wealth tax, because there is an enormous amount of wealth, particularly property, in this country. And there is an argument for saying that given that you also can't shift physical property abroad, it's almost impossible to run away from a wealth tax, that what they ought to be doing is finding a mechanism to extract more money from land and from physical assets. Now, the reason...
Can I just ask about that? Because I don't want to get bogged down in this. We want to get through some more questions, but it's always seemed to me that taking more money out of property, revaluing council tax, all the rest of it, has always seemed such an obvious way of raising more money. And it always strikes me as something that no political party is going to do, because in the end, it's impossible to do without quite a substantial revaluation of people's houses and everything else, which would be seen as a sort of snooper's charter, people coming round, the right-wing press would say it's a tax on your conservatory and all the rest of it. It feels to me like one of those things every government thinks about and then thinks, oh no, that's probably going to be a bit. Is that fair or not fair?
Okay, so that's one of the reasons why governments run away from it. The other reason people run away from it is because quite a lot of older people are asset rich and income poor.
True.
And so, there's there's an issue about if you just happen to have lived in a house for 30 years, but you're not on an enormous pension, how are you going to find the money to pay the increased tax, whether it's council tax or a separate wealth tax? The answer to that, which I wrote about in a book called WTF quite a few years ago, is what you do.
Very good book if you're looking for something to read.
It's still relevant. What any government could do, it's hard politically. I'm going to talk about the sweetener in a minute, but what you can do is, for those who are cash poor but asset rich, you simply calculate the tax that these people owe, and then at the moment they crystallise the asset, that's the moment that the tax gets paid, or when they die, the tax gets paid. And because the problem for any government is not just it needs cash, it needs certainty of income. And that would give certainty. You could borrow colossal sums of money, government could borrow colossal sums of money against the certainty that even if they don't get the money from any bit of property for 10 years, they know it's coming, right? So, but the other thing you need to do if you're moving to a wealth tax system of this sort is you do have to provide, you have to basically cut income tax, right? You have to give people a reason to want to do it. One of the ways you give people a reason to do it is just to say, right, we're taking more because there's been an explosion in the value of assets, but the benefit for most of you is you'll pay less in income tax.
Okay, I've got a question from Ifion, I think. I'm not sure I've pronounced that name right. So if I haven't, I'm sorry. I'm so confused. Is PIP going to change or stay the same? Well, I suppose the reality is there's the TIMS.
Well, it is going to change. It's just not for years.
Yeah,
and the interesting thing about this,
possibly not really.
Well, we don't know. I mean, look, they have promised to come up with proposals in, just over a year's time.
Yeah.
Right? I think it's the autumn of 2026 they said they'd come up with some proposals. They may turn out to be significant, or they may turn out to be...
They're not going to risk this kind of political pain. I mean, they're not going to be able to, are they?
No. So, look, I think if I...
Politically, this is done.
I think you're right that a year from now, we feel quite close to an election, right? So I slightly agree with you that what they have now done, it's a bit like oh God, all the debacles over reforming social care, right? Every government goes into office saying we're going to reform social care, and none of them have the political guts, whatever the size of the majority, to do it. And I think we are now probably in a situation with reforming the disability, the disability payment system that, I suspect you're right that this is now off the agenda for donkey's years.
Brian Davis asks, this is a question I suggest we don't answer, but I'm going to why are we not talking about the elephant in the room, Brexit, since we are losing over 40 billion a year? Brian, Robert and I have talked about Brexit probably more than any other subject over the last decade, and if you've probably heard every single thing. If you haven't, well, we've spent a lot of time talking about it, so let's not answer that one.
Just to confirm, we are poorer because of Brexit. Let's move on.
Let's have a one-sentence answer. Is there any possibility, we've discussed this a million times, we're going to ask it again, in your view, that there's going to be any significant change in our relationship with Europe, moving back towards closer integration anytime soon?
What do you mean by soon? Define a timescale.
Oh, that's good. Oh, that's a good comeback. I mean, before the next election.
I think there's a serious possibility that the next election could be fought in part on getting us back to a closer relationship. So,
interesting. You've never really said that before. We've discussed this stuff.
I think I have said that to you before. Honestly, I think
have I?
Yeah, I think I have. But anyway, whether you've heard, whether you heard me before or not, that is what I think.
I think
it's quite hard before the election, given where Starmer stood before the election, again back to the kind of things he said during the campaign, for him to essentially take us back into the single market, in effect, before the election, but I can see the election being fought on that basis.
Well, we're about to have the vote, but as we do, I just want to say, Sugar asks, how damaging to Labour's sustained government and re-election in 2028 is this? Do you think this and winter fuel could see them voted out in 2028, 29? The only thing I would say, Sugar, is 2028, 29 is a long way away, and all kinds of things can happen between now and then. Labour does have a big majority, and 4 years is a very long time. Let's just take a listen. So I think it's going very badly, and we'll talk about this for the Labour government, but let's hear what's happened to this particular vote.
149. Whoa. The noes to the left, 328.
Right, so it's an overwhelming majority for the government.
Which I guess, given the total cave-in, you'd have absolutely expected.
The ayes to the right, 149. The noes to the left, 328. The noes have it, unlocked.
Yeah, so look, because of the capitulation.
Not a lot of cheering there.
No, because the whole thing has been
depressing and
depressing sort of all round, really.
Yeah,
but I mean, for the reputation of the government, the fact that they ran all their troops up the hill, shouted at them to try and vote for reforms that these MPs didn't wanted. I told you the other night that there was one meeting where some Labour MPs were actually in tears because they felt they were being bullied by Downing Street. It's just the amount of time and effort that's gone into this, whereas what should have happened is they should have produced a paper and then at the time of the budget come up with some more rounded reforms. They've charged headlong into it, and for the point that you made, it is pretty much a disaster because there are many elements of our welfare system that are not rational. The cost of welfare is going up at an unsustainable rate, and it is very hard to see now before the election how those costs are brought under control. I mean, unless you believe, which I sort of do, actually not sort of do, I do, unless you believe that massively improving the service given by the health service, we're going to get a 10-year plan for the health service on Thursday, will have a significant positive impact on how many people, register for disabled payments. But that then requires the government to do something which is also hard, which is to fix the health service.
I mean, we'll crack on with some more questions now, but just one point I would make about it. I keep thinking, we're only 1 year into this government, and if you compare, for the sake of argument, where we were 1 year into Blair or 1 year into the coalition, like whether you like the politics, you like the personalities or anything else, the government felt a lot more stable, a lot more purposeful, regardless of whether you liked what it was doing. Whereas this government just feels really unstable, which is weird given how big its majority is. It keeps going forward,
mad.
then
It's
reversing.
mad.
It's
It's
like,
completely mad.
all these self-inflicted mistakes. It's it's really startling.
Yeah, it's terrible for them, and it's sort of obviously I spent a lot of my time trying to work out why they've got it so badly wrong, and a lot of it is Starmer, some would say, has done pretty well on the international stage, but he hasn't been engaged enough domestically, and in the end, it's about him, and he's got to sort it out.
Okay, Courtney, I don't know the answer to this. Is there anything about the access to work cuts, as I'm worried I will have to leave my job? Do you know the answer to that one?
Sorry, say that again. What's the question?
Courtney says, is there anything about the access to work cuts, as I'm worried I will have to leave my job?
I don't think there is anything now in this bill that should make you more anxious than you would otherwise have been. I mean, pretty much. I mean, the thing that is left in the bill, just to be, should remind people, universal credit, the rate is going up at its fastest rate ever as a result of this bill. The so-called work capability assessment, which is the assessment that people have to go through to get the disability payments under that's being abolished, and that's now being rolled into the sort of, but the PRIP criteria we don't know as yet, but there's nothing there that I think should cause anxiety. And then there is just all this stuff about work coaches, the money being spent on helping disabled people into work. All of that money is still going to be legislated for, and those structures put in place. So I don't know. I don't think there's anything for her to worry about. But
this is a point rather than a question, but it is worth reading out just because it's a reminder. Carth Doll, it's so hard to get PIP. The application form and assessment are brutal. It is soul-destroying to provide so much medical evidence and be questioned about intimate matters to be turned down. And, I guess that is why the government is where it is. It went forward with this. Obviously, there are a lot of vulnerable people who are affected, and the party was just not having it.
I don't know if you watched the debate.
Yeah.
But there were
a lot of it was very emotional.
Really moving testimony from particularly Labour MPs, but not exclusively Labour MPs, about their personal experience of disability, about the experience of their constituents. These were heartbreaking stories about vulnerable people, and as I was listening to it this afternoon, I did think to myself, if the government doesn't capitulate in the way that it does, I did think actually that the tenor of debate was such that did I think they were going to lose? I thought they might just scrape through, but by a margin that it just wasn't worth the risk. The argument all afternoon was going away from Starmer, Reeves and Liz Kendall. They were losing the argument. And it's almost as though they don't live in these three politicians don't live in the real world, because what one heard in the debate was stuff we all know about really vulnerable people who desperately needed the support. And as you just heard, it's really hard to claim PIP. It's not easy.
Yeah. I mean, Retro Nut says they need to ask what disabled people want, not just change it to how they want it, because they are not disabled and they don't know what it's like to be disabled. A kind of fair point. And many people have made that point, as Robert said.
But that is allegedly what's now happening with Stephen Timms' review, right?
Yeah. Michael Hansen, we've sort of addressed this, but I'll read it out anyway. Why didn't the government debate this in more detail before announcing the cuts? The climb down will not bring back those poor souls that have taken their lives over this. I mean, on the first point, Michael, why didn't the government debate this in more detail? It does seem this is not the first time the government has not seen how big the opposition to something would be. And I think there is a lot of grounds for questioning their basic political judgment. Rodders asks...
Because, just to be clear, if I didn't make this point earlier, it just needs to be made. This was driven by Rachel Reeves's fiscal rules, the fear that she was going to break them, And, essentially the fact that she has given authority, actually, George Osborne originally did this years ago, but it's the Office of Budget Responsibility which determines whether or not, assesses whether or not you're meeting your fiscal rules. And, essentially whether or not the public finances are in surplus or deficit by a few billion 5 years from now, right, is the maddest way to determine a policy as sensitive as reforming how people get disability benefit. And it's a completely irrational system. They've got to find a different system because, they will never get any serious government done if what they continue to do is make changes without really understanding the significance of the changes, failing to do precisely what the questioner asked, which is to do a proper review before you announce what the changes will do.
OK, I'm going to put these two questions together and we probably then better wind up. Rod has asked, will taxes have to be raised, give with one hand, take away with the other? And we haven't actually, I guess there's the question of, they were going to save $5 billion for this. Again, important as you say for the fiscal rules. They're now not going to save $5 billion. So, we need to address exactly what they're going to do about that. And Amy asks, will Rachel Reeves be finished as Chancellor if she has to raise taxes in the autumn? What do you reckon on both those?
So
in a position,
I think she's got. I think she is in quite serious trouble now, and I'll tell you why. This is not. Keir Starmer will not want to raise taxes, right? He certainly won't want to raise taxes by, 7 to 10 billion, maybe more than that they need to find. And so my own view, going back to the original point I was making about the irrationality of your policy being dictated by these mad forecasts, which are, the OBR, really bright people, good institution, they would always acknowledge that there are massive uncertainties around their forecasts, right? They're probably a better forecasting organisation than many. That's what research seems to show. It does, but the whole point about forecasts is they're always wrong, right? What they are is they're a guide about where you're going, but they've become religion. Now, my own view would be that the fiscal rules and then how you judge how a minister then translates what the OBR says about whether you're hitting them or missing them into policy, all of that has to be looked at in a really fundamental way and changed because government decisions are being taken totally irrationally. I fear that were they to set on a path of essentially changing the so-called fiscal system for keeping us honest in a borrowing sense, that I don't see how Rachel Reeves survives that kind of change because she has defined herself so much by the fiscal rules are only the only thing that matter and hitting them is the only thing that matters. If the government comes off that, I just think at that point, she is finished. And so there is a big political dilemma for the Prime Minister, basically, which is, does he move to a more sensible system for combining sensible stewardship of the public finances with policy making? But if he does that, he's probably got to dump his Chancellor. Or does he stick with his Chancellor and, broadly risk having to do some very unpopular things like shoving up taxes by billions in the autumn?
I tell you what, we've got our main episode of Talking Politics, which Robert and I are doing tomorrow. Do tune in for it because I think we need to talk about this because it's a fascinating discussion. What does she do about her fiscal rules? What does she do about the OBR? Is this the moment when things change? We'll also talk about whether Rachel Reeves survives and indeed what Keir Starmer's political prospects are because right now, They don't look too great. That's all we have time for. Thank you for all the questions, and sorry if we hadn't had time to answer yours, but we'll also do Q&As regularly in the form of podcasts, which you can watch in full here on YouTube and on ITVX, or indeed you can listen to it on your podcast platform of choice. Keep your eye out for another episode tomorrow, which I've just as I've been saying, where we'll have more reaction to tonight's events and all of the other key talking points. Until then, thanks for tuning in. Goodbye.